Hey everyone, welcome back to Basic Level Gaming. Today we are going to continue on in our Learning to Play Chess series. We're going to specifically focus on openings. And the opening phase of chess is the beginning part where you are trying to take control of the board, and we talked a little bit about that last time on what's considered control and where you want to focus like the most of your control, which would be the center 4 squares on the board. You want to definitely control as much of that as possible, as well as controlling squares that are into your opponent's territory. Basically, the more spaces you control, then that's the fewer spaces your opponent can move and be able to attack you with. So you definitely want to try to limit as much of their movement as possible. That gives you a bigger advantage. So that's ultimately what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about some good openings, some questionable openings and why. And then we'll start to, as we move along, we'll start to get into some of the textbook openings. We won't do that today, but just later on in the series we'll talk more about there's certain openings that kind of run in a series and set up a specific position in the game. So that's something we'll get to later on, but today we're just going to talk about the basic concepts of openings. So let's go ahead and get started. So on this first board here, you're going to see we're starting primarily with just a brand new board. White's made their opening move, and I'm going to start to, while we're doing the videos, I'm going to start trying to use the rank and files in order to kind of get you used to that concept, as well as just it's an easier way to explain where we're moving from and to. So you'll see here, first of all, I want to point out this red square here. You'll remember that is the center of the board. That's where your control is very important. You want as much of that control as you can because it gives you a lot of flexibility. So in that sense, White has made their first move, which is bringing the E pawn up to E4. That is a super common opening for White. It gives them control of the D5 and F5 squares, and just kind of gets that opening right out of the bat. Let me get in here and get a part of the board. So very respectable opening. I actually really suggest it when you're just getting new to the game, because you're forcing the opponent to be kind of reactionary, especially if they're also new to the game. They may not know as much about like the openings and where to control and things like that if they haven't done as much studying. So it's a really good way to start. So the next question is then, what do you do if you're playing black? So they took that control, right? So they've already got those 2 squares. In the spirit of taking the same amount of control and getting back that power, so to speak, it's a very acceptable move, and probably preferable, it's certainly the move I would make, would be to take your E pawn as well and put it up on E5. So, because then you're going to be in control of the D4 square and the F4 square. So really kind of mirroring White's move here. And that's really what I would suggest. It really puts you in as much control as the opponent, because if you move your D pawn up to D5 thinking you're going to attack the pawn, the problem with that is they're just going to take your pawn, and now they've got control of land in your territory. So you really don't want to do that. You don't want to give up the pawn, but also you're giving them more control and leaving yourself with nothing. So definitely a good place to start is the E pawns and moving them out there to get as much of that center territory as you can. So let's take a look at the next move then. So you moved your E pawns up there, and so here you're going to see that white did what I just talked about, which is moving their d pawn up on d4 to attack the black pawn that's on e, as well as control the c5 square. And we kind of already talked a little bit about this, but the reason that that's not a solid move when that black pawn is already there is that the black is just going to take their e5 pawn and move it to d4 and take that pawn away. And then they have control, black has control of c3 and e3. And yes, the queen could come out and grab the pawn, but typically you don't want to move your queen out that early because it just puts her in danger. So you're still in a really good spot there. So that's really the problem with that second move, is that you're just giving up material. You're putting yourself in a worse position. And we talked about last time how, or the last couple times, about how the goal is always to leave yourself in a better position than you were before your move. If there's any way to do that, that's your goal. So that's what I wanted to talk about there as far as that particular move. So let's look at a different way. So let's look at if we're playing white. So you'll see here that as white, we went ahead and made the typical move of the e pawn to e4. So that's great. But you'll see black decided to go a different route. They decided to move a pawn that is completely away from the center. And this could be a thought process of maybe trying to get the rook out. I don't know. I've seen this move in a game, and it's a very bad move. For one, this pawn only gains control of the b5 square. It only gains control of one square because it's against the edge. And that square is still in their territory. It's not in the center of the board. I mean, it's just not, they're not gaining anything. They're not getting themselves, like we talked about, in a better position than they were before. So now this is where it kind of changes a little bit from what we talked about on the last board. Because black did not take any control of the center, the next move is going to be to take your d2 pawn and move it up to d4. Because now, with doing that, you're gaining control of c5, d5, e5, and f5. So you have a whole section, not just the middle, but even the next two out, in black's territory. So that's a really good situation to take control of. So the next question is then, what would black do to try to recover? Well, black is going to, in this case, make the same mistake that we talked about before, where they're moving their pawn up into just giving it away, basically. And so really what happened here is black said, oh man, I don't have any control of the center, I better try to get in there. So they moved their e pawn out to e5, which normally would be a good move if that d4 pawn was not there. But because of the d4 pawn, you're going to see that what we're going to do, we're going to take that d4 pawn and we're just going to move it up and take and capture the e5 pawn. What that does is that gives white control of d6 and f6, and then d5 and f5. So they've got this whole, these are both in black's territory, so it's really good control. And a lot of times we talked about before, you don't really want to double up your pawns necessarily, But this case, it's actually just fine because you're gaining a lot of control in black's territory, and it's early on in the game to get that control as well. So black can't just jump right back from that. They have to figure out how to get back from that. So it's a very solid move to make and give you some good control there. So if that's not a good move for black, well, you're going to see another one here, and I specifically got this one because it is one that you see, but it's certainly not a good move. Black decides to take the h7 pawn and move it out to mirror what they did on the A rank. And it's just as bad now as it was when they did it on the first turn. Because now white starts, they just have so much control in the board here, you know. And that's really what you're wanting to avoid, is to give your opponent that much control. So these outside pieces, I mean, they're really not great moves for a while in the game. Because here's the other problem is, when you move those very edge pieces, you're also getting rid of some of that safe haven that you create when you castle, where your king is tucked back in the edge. Because now there's an open path right on in there for a bishop or a queen to sneak in and put you in really big trouble. So just really avoid that. This is not something you want to do here. So the next thing we want to look at is we want to activate some other pieces. We've got our pawns out there, we've got control. Now we want to take some control by activating additional pieces. And I remember if you remember, we talked a little bit about activating, but what activating is it's basically making your pieces available, making them out there so they can actually go on the attack or protect a piece or something like that. When you're looking at this board here, which is basically white, then instead of moving any more pawns anywhere, they decided to activate their knight from the G1 square and put it up on the F3 square. And you remember, we talked about the knights. We don't want to put it over here on H3 because it only gets half the control as it does in F3, because on F3 it gets 8 squares that it could move to on the next turn if it needed to. So this piece is now activated because it could come out here and it could attack. It can protect like this, the D4 pawn, and so that's what you want to do. You want to activate some of these pieces out here. And you'll see now black is getting on board. They're moving a piece that they should move. They're jumping out with the knight from B8 and putting it on C6, which is a good move. It's putting pressure on the D4 pawn. I mean, granted, we have some backup, but it still puts pressure on it. And it's also out here ready to move and ready to attack. So that's really what you're wanting to look at when you're talking about activating pieces, is getting them out and able to use. Like now, both of our bishops could come out. They could get out here and attack. Now, they're not really fully activated yet because they only have one path they can take. You know, if you move the bishop, like if you take this light squared bishop on F1 and move it out to, say, C4, now it's got 2 different paths that it could go down to make some attacks. So just kind of think about it that way, like where are you giving your pieces the best opportunity to be useful? So the last thing I want to kind of look at is moving a little bit past. We're not really moving out of the opening because we're still going to be activating pieces here. But if we look at this next board, you'll see that what white did next after that knight move from black is moved the D4 pawn to D5. The purpose of that is, it was before black took their turn, this knight was over on C6. So now white's pawn is attacking that knight. If that knight doesn't move, then that knight is going to die. It's going to get captured. The knight can't move over to e5 because then white's knight can take it. It can't move down to d4 because white's knight can take it. It can't move to, well, it could, but it's not super effective. It could move down to b4 and still be safe, but it would be still in danger. So now they move it over to a5. And this is where you have an opportunity to basically make it so this knight has no opportunity to live. Because the only squares the knight can move to is back up to c6, down to c4, down to b3, and that's it. Because it can't move up here on b7 because it's got its own pawn in the way. Well, we know if it goes back to c6, it's going to get captured. If it goes to c4, then the light squared bishop is going to take it. And if it goes to b3, then my pawns are going to take it. So what this is going to be called is trapping. You're making it so black cannot save this knight. And the way you can do that is by taking your b2 pawn and moving it to b4. And at that point, no matter what black does with that knight, it's gone. You've gained that knight. And that's something you want to keep an eye on even when you're opening your pieces. If you have a way to gain material, you still want to do it. You know, as long as it's not putting you in a worse position, get out there and get it. I mean, you might as well. And you're still, in this case, then, the pawn is still going to have some control on the board. And now the dark squared bishop could come up here and come out too. Not that that's the best place for it, but it could if it needed to. So you just give yourself a lot more room. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about there, was just being able to trap a piece so that it can't move. And don't overlook those, you know. When you're setting up your position, you still want to keep an eye out for where you can gain material. That's primarily what I wanted to talk about today in the openings. And, you know, we will continue to develop on these concepts. And I think we're really getting close to a point where I want to play a game on the stream or on the video and just kind of break it down and analyze the game. And I think we'll do that, if not Thursday, then next Tuesday, because I really think that's going to start putting it all together and kind of showing what it all looks like. And like I said before, we will make mistakes. I will still make a ton of mistakes, there's no doubt. But that's how you learn, is by taking those mistakes and analyzing them and figuring out what you could have done better next time. So definitely hope you'll join us, and we will see you on Thursday. And Thursday we're going to talk a little bit more about specific moves, like how we're going to talk about forking and skewering, which are going to be different types of captures. And if we have time, we'll also talk about a discovered check, which are all different types of captures that make it to where you're going to gain material even if the other player decides to do something unexpected or whatever. You're putting them in a position where they cannot do anything but give you a piece. So we'll talk about those here next on Thursday. So hopefully you'll join us. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on those notifications. And for sure, leave a comment down below if you have any ideas, concerns, if you feel like something I said wasn't quite right. I'd love to hear from everybody, and we will see you on Thursday. Have a great day.